This lesson we're going to be practicing connecting to an API using the fetch method in JavaScript. So connecting to our HTML file, we've got a JavaScript file, we've got a little bit of styling, a couple elements, we've got a button and a div. We also have a JSON file, and there's a ton of data within this JSON file. And this is the same data that we're getting within the random user ME API. So it's the same results. So this is just so that we can practice locally and limit the number of requests we're making to the endpoint while we're developing the application. So we're going to start by selecting and creating the web URLs. And we can use either the web endpoint or the local JSON data, adding an event listener to our button, and that event triggers the getting of the data. So that's where the fetch request is. It retrieves back the content as JSON formatted content. It sends the results array over to the output results function, which iterates through each one of those items, adding them to the output element. So it produces this type of result where we get a listing, and we've got quite a lot of information contained within the JSON data, so within the objects, and we can go several levels deep, and there's a lot of data that's nested. So we've got a lot of objects where we've got objects that are nested within them, and also arrays that are nested, and string values. So there's a lot of content, and this is a really nice deep JSON object where you can really get more familiar with retrieving values and from the properties within the JavaScript object. This lesson we're going to be looking at fetch. So I've got an HTML file linked to a JavaScript file, and the JavaScript file is on the same directory, and I've also got a JSON file. So let's add in a page element. I'm going to give it a class of output. So this is where we could potentially output some content after we've got a successful fetch request. So going into the JavaScript code, I'm going to select that element with the class of output, and then using the document query selector, make a selection of that element into an object that we've given a variable name of output. And also within the HTML, I'll select and update and apply some styling. And we'll add in a button on the page, and I'll just say click me. And for the button element, we can apply some styling. So let's just add some basic padding to that element. So we've got a big click me button there, and then we've got the output content. I'm actually going to move the output just underneath the click me, and we can save that. And with JavaScript, we want to also select the button. So using the document, and because I've only got the one button element, I can select it by its tag, which is the button tag. So this will give us an event that we can fire off whenever it gets clicked, that we can launch this event. And I'll call the event getData. And within the function, let's create a function called getData. So this is going to trigger off the fetch request. Let's also set some variables. So we've got a URL, and this is going to be the endpoint where we're going to make the fetch request to. I've got a API that's available. It's a random user ME API, and this is a really good API to practice and make requests to. So the endpoint is going to be random user API, and you can also specify how many results you want. And in this case, we're just getting the one result, but we can also add in a parameter of results, and that will return back more results from the endpoint. And this is already within a JSON formatted data. So let's use this as our testing URL for the endpoint, and we'll make a fetch request and retrieve back the data that's contained within there. So fetch does require some parameters, and the main parameter that it requires is going to be the URL. So what the fetch does is it provides a JavaScript interface for accessing and manipulating parts of an HTTP pipeline. So this is on an HTTP page, and we're able to request it using just the get method. And it allows us to select those resources asynchronously across the network. So fetch is once it makes the connection to the endpoint, we can retrieve back the response object, and fetch is promise-based. So once we do get the response back, we can do something with that response object. And it has a few built-in methods, such as JSON and text. So if you are expecting JSON data, this is a method that returns the second promise and resolves the result, parsing the response body as JSON. So response body content, or the text that it gets retrieved back, and that's going to be all of this stuff. So it sends it back as JSON. And then for the next promise, we can get data back. And then we can do something with that data within our code. So for now, we'll log it out into the console as data. And opening up the DevTools and the console, let's see what happens when we click. We get an array of results. So we only want to actually get all of the results. So returning back the array of the results. And this is where we can make use of that response content. If there are any errors, you can also add in a catch. So this is a way to catch any errors that might happen within your requests. And then you can output the console, and we'll output as a console error, and whatever the error message is, so the error response from the object, and we can save that. So we're getting back the data results, and this is being returned back as an array. So that's getting all of this information returned back as a result. I'm also going to copy and paste this into the data 18 JSON. And so now this is going to store that information into our JSON file. So we can actually update the URL to be the local URL, and that's going to be that data 18 JSON. And the reason I'm doing this is that this is going to cut down on the number of requests we're making to the server, and it's also going to return back that JSON file within that same structure. So let's make a request to the JSON file. And remember, this is going to be our local JSON file. And we see we've got all of this data. So it's coming from this local JSON file. And there's a lot of stuff in there. So now, once we've selected the data, we want to loop through the data and output it onto the page. If there is any error with the file or the file location, then we're going to catch that within the error response and output it as a console error. And that's being returned back in line number 15. So we can see that unexpected token in the JSON. So that just basically means that it's not JSON, and it didn't retrieve back proper JSON data. So next, let's create a function that's going to output the results, and it's going to expect one parameter that's going to be an array. So we'll iterate through the results array once we get the data in, and loop through for each and get each one of the items. And I'll give it a name of item. And then within the console, let's take a look at what we retrieve back for item. So when we click it, and these items are going to be objects that we can select content from these objects. And I'm going to output some HTML content. So using the backticks. And from the item, I can get the name and also open that object up. And we've got within the name property, we've got a value of first, which is going to be a string value for that. And let's add in the title, and then also do the last name. I'm going to adjust the editor, updating the word wrap so that we can see all of the content within that HTML content. And I don't have any HTML in there yet, so what I actually wanted to do is just make sure that everything is working properly. Let's wrap it within a div and select that output element, and we'll output the inner HTML and adding to the current inner HTML will add the HTML object. And that also means that we should clear out before we, so just clear out any existing content. So that allows us to list out some of the results from that data object. As we're looping through, we can also get an index value. So if we wanted to, we could list the index value. And that will just be as index. And we should add 1 to it because the index is going to start out at 0. So that gives us this kind of list-like format with all of the names. If we want to get the picture, so that's also contained within the picture object. So let's take HTML and we'll add to HTML. So I also need to update this as let. So when we're adding to the HTML, let's create a div, and then within the div I'll use the image, set up the source for the image, and then we'll close off the div. So get all of the HTML out of the way, and then use the template literal to get the item picture, and let's grab the thumbnail as the source of the image. So it's going to return back those images of those users. And of course, now you can, once you get the data, you can make adjustments as needed. If you ever want to go back to the live API, there are some limits to it. So if you request it too many times, they're going to block you. So there's only so many requests that you can make within a given period. So that's why when I am practicing and connecting to the APIs, I will get the JSON data within a local connection. And then I'll build my application that way. And then once I go live, then I'm not making that many requests or unnecessary requests to the endpoint.